Hi, guys, and welcome to the newest episode of the Code Chameleon podcast. This is episode 2, and today we're talking about event sourcing. And the guest of today is a man that really enjoys multitasking, whether if it's in his work as a lead architect at Vipps Mobile Pay, where he's trying to tame 30 wild developers across 3 sites, or if it's at home trying to control 3 kids at the same time as having major renovation done on his house. He's a strong communicator, having held multiple workshops teaching developers across multiple different topics, and works relentlessly on improving the code quality and ways of working at Vipps Mobile Pay. Today's guest is Rene Rotvig. Welcome, Rene, and thank you for dropping by.
Hey, Stefan, thank you for having me.
So, Rene, tell me a little bit about who you are and what you're doing at Vipps Mobile Pay.
My name is Rene. I've been at Mobile Pay for I think around 7 or 8 years now. Came right out of university where I did a master thesis in distributed systems. That's probably also why I'm very interested in today's topic.
Oh,
At
yeah,
least
very
that has
related.
been
Very related. Yeah,
that has been quite native for me to follow that track. Yeah.
sure. Is it from Aarhus University or Copenhagen?
Yeah, I did a master's in engineering at Aarhus University.
Okay,
I
cool.
was done in 2018.
Yeah. Cool stuff. All right. So before we get started with the main subject, we have a few games just to get you to know you a little bit better. And the first up is what I like to call "What's in your office," and that's the kind of the segment where we usually, as the developers, we have something weird in our office, like a chameleon in the background or something weird. So the question is, Rene, do you have something weird in your office?
I'm not sure I have something weird, but in general, my office is a new office from day to day. I usually rent tables from other people because my job as lead architect in Mobile Pay is a lot about communicating, as you also mentioned. So that means I actually don't own a desk at the moment. So I'm just being thrown around, but I'm actually okay with that. I like talking with people, and I like to be part of different communities, and I have 4 teams today that I need to interact with. So it's completely okay for me. But at my last desk, there was a lot of Lego.
That's always a plus.
Yeah, exactly,
That would definitely be like the desk that I would gravitate towards.
exactly.
Yeah, but you have a lot of really good developers in Aarhus, where you're sitting every day, and also in Copenhagen, which is the office that I'm a part of at the moment. And you really do a lot of great work on kind of taming these wild developers and consultants as well.
Thank you, Stefan. It is a very interesting job, and I love working with all the people, also in Aarhus and in Copenhagen. Furthermore, we also have a Oslo office where we also have a lot of great people and a
Yeah.
lot of different opinions. But I only see that as a good thing.
Yeah. That's usually a sign of intelligent people, right? If they have opinions.
Exactly.
Yeah. I do notice one thing that's a little bit weird with your office. You actually have a plant that's alive. Is that your wife taking care of it?
Yeah, I think that's my wife. I can't
Yeah.
shake the name of that.
Same. All right. And then on to the next segment, which is what I call the binary battle. I'm going to throw out a few statements, and you can choose one or the other, but not both, obviously, just to get to know you a little bit better. And the first one is the infamous tabs or spaces.
I've been born and raised with tabs. I don't have a
Right.
strong opinion. I don't judge. I see a lot of different setups. I think if we're in this ballpark, I don't know if that question is gonna come, but when I see people with white screen instead of black, that's where I leave the room.
Yeah, exactly. That's a crazy developer or a poor developer.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Next one. Early bird coder or night owl hacker?
I'm forced to be an early bird coder with 3 kids below 3, so that has to be an early one.
Yeah. You and me both. You and me both. I would prefer night owl hacker if I were allowed to, but not at the moment. I'll have to wait a few years, I guess, before there's room for that again. A little bit more technical now. ORM or raw SQL queries?
That's a good question. I definitely prefer the more SQL queries. I've used the OIM that's part of the entity framework, and it's doing a great job, especially lately with the whole .NET Core updates that it has received. But I think during my time in mobile pay, I've seen different funny behaviors with the OIMs, and I just think I grew too tired of these sudden issues that we have seen that have just completely gone all to raw SQL queries now, especially with the AI tooling you have today to generate queries and help you spar on the queries you can make. Has just grown a lot easier,
Oh
especially
yeah,
also understanding other people's queries for that sake.
sure.
So it just seems more simple to me, and
Yeah,
you are also a bit more in control.
yeah. But I think it's coming back a little bit. I mean, I'm a little bit older than you, and I definitely at my first job that was like raw SQL for the win, and maybe it was even before Entity Framework. No, maybe not quite, but almost. So I know well a little bit of SQL. I wouldn't call myself a SQL expert, but there was like a few years where it was ORM all the way, right? It was very seldom that you saw a SQL query, only if you talk to maybe a DBA. But I think it's coming back, as you say, because yeah, I don't know, maybe people grew tired like you did of the issues you
I
you
think
had before.
I think when I started in my sort of first job in 2014, I think we used a database called RavenDB. I think it was. There was an OIM for that, and that was used in that company that worked quite well. I think you're right. It's times changing because
Yeah.
OIMs has really been in over the years. When I started in mobile pay, everything was raw SQL, nearly everything,
Mm,
with some exceptions. So I just think I grew accustomed to it. Before SQL, we have just merged with a company called Vips, and in mobile pay itself, we used a blob storage database called Cassandra, or distributed database, and it used a language called SQL, which are even more specific on what you're allowed to do. SQL itself are actually quite flexible.
mhm,
SQL is not, and I think that maybe forces you in a specific direction,
sure.
especially with what I've seen with OMs, where people try to normalize data a lot, like having yeah, normalized data. Where in SQL you're forced to duplicate data, basically have specific tables for specific types of data. That's
Mm,
it's a different way of thinking. I think I'm uh, maybe a bit more acquainted to that.
sure. Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm an EF core guy, but I think it's very important that you know what the tool can do and what it cannot do, and how to use it. Because if you don't, then you'll get in trouble for sure.
Mm.
It's a very powerful tool if you know how to use it.
Yeah, and then it can also help you get up and running really fast, basically.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All right, you touched it a little bit. AI coding assistants, yay or nay?
Uh, I haven't really been coding that much the last year, and it's honestly it's the last year that this has been really been taken up as I see it. Um, I think it's in a tryout state, so for sure I would do it if I pick it up again soon,
Mm,
just to try it out and see if it can help me. But also by doing vibe coding, it's also sometimes just easier, especially if you know what you do.
yeah.
But
The last part is very important. You
yes,
got to know what to do, right?
but it's I right now I think it's a good sparring partner
Yeah,
to get you
I agree.
started and in a direction.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I really like about Vips Mobile Pay. You actually encourage to use it right in the right way, obviously, and then have be in control. But kind of using these tools really makes a big difference,
Mm,
especially when you're troubleshooting. I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I also hope, at least in Virtual by Pay, we can take it even further. If we look a bit away from coding, there's a lot of company picking up to have their sort of Wikipedias, internal Wikipedias. Some use Confluence or other tools, and have that published to an AI. So that means every time you search for information in the company, you can just ask an AI about it. Can you find something about, I don't know, a domain page for this area or whatever
Yeah.
it is? And it can
Yeah.
actually help you with that. I think that's quite powerful in regards to documentation. But also, I always hear that this is a living page on Confluence. It's always Confluence page is always dead pages, basically. So
Right.
it's just left there and nobody knows it's there. That's the issue, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's very powerful to have AI start picking these things up and present it for people who ask for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. All right. Last one, and I think this is very important for guys like us, René. Coffee or energy drink?
Us both.
But at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time. Isn't that I think it's called a pedagogical coffee or pedagog-kaffe. It's when you pour in coffee into the mocha master, and instead of water, you put in Monster.
Let's go. All right. I think we know you a little bit better now. So I think we should get started with the main event, and let's just throw ourselves at it. What is event sourcing?
Yeah, let's jump into it. Well, I want to start really simple here. I don't have a big image of how event sourcing works by events coming in and other events coming out. Let's start at the bare minimum. What is an event source? Like, if you look at it from a database perspective, I mean, I'm gonna show it later in the demo. An event source is essentially just a table that contains events. What is an event? It's a named event that contains some properties. And in an event source context, it also has a sequence. And that sequence is quite important because ordering in event sourcing is really important because that's what determined what came first. Um, that's what I want to go into right now in regards to event sourcing. Because before we jump into event sourcing, there's also something called an aggregate. Let's try to look into that. I have a small slide on that.
All right. Just share your screen here.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
If you look at the book, Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans, it actually gives you a lot of good terms before you jump into event sourcing. It's a good way of communicating about what you do. There are some terms here like what is a domain? There is get the ubiquitous language in place. There's the aggregates I mentioned before. There's entities, service, and repositories. All these terms can also help you sort of structure your solution. I have an example of how it could be done. And that means when you speak with other people about this, you're not in doubt what they talk about because there is a lot of terms you need to understand. There's a lot of concepts you need to understand in event sourcing. But that's sort of what I think you need to know before you jump into it. So if we look at the aggregate part, we have on the right side here, the circle here is what I encapsulated as I just used the example user aggregate boundary in this case. So that's our boundary essentially. And in that boundary, we have our entities. And entities in this case is, for example, age or social security number, name, or address. What's important with these four properties, if you gather them into an aggregate or aggregate them, that's what came first. Did the name age get registered first? Did the address get registered first? That's where the sequence comes in. And let's try to understand why the order here is important. If suddenly the name changes in the lifetime of that aggregate, a user is typically an unbound aggregate, so that means it will never die unless somebody invents something called GDPR and you have to close it. But that's a different topic.
Oh, the horror.
Yeah. Usually it's not a good idea to have an unbound aggregate anyway, but that's what it is. And that's because it's unbound, it can grow forever. So that's the simple reason. In this case, a user aggregate boundary is typically not an aggregate that changes that often, but it's a good way to sort of get all the data collected. So let's see if the name changes in sequence 1 and it changes again in sequence 3. If you switch around those two sequences, you will end up when you get the aggregated state having the wrong name, essentially. So that's why the sequence inside the aggregate boundary is important. The sequence across aggregate boundary is not important. Typically, that depends on the system you're making. But if you're making a system, try stick to that. Make sure the sequences across aggregates are not related in any manner. Because if you have that, then you probably should get into the design of your system and see if you can redesign it.
So essentially, could you say that it's an event sourcing system is essentially like having snapshots of all the states that a given entity has gone through its lifetime?
Well, let's not try to call it snapshots, because that is actually a concept in event sourcing.
All right.
And it's something different. An aggregate essentially is just a list of events with a sequence, where if you want the aggregated state, current state of that aggregate, you just take that list of events and you go through each event, and then you concatenate them or aggregate them, whatever concept you use. And in the end, you come out with a sort of, this is the current state of that aggregate. That's essentially event sourcing.
All right. All right. So if you would go through the debugger, and I've been married 3 times and changing my name each time, it would actually like change the value on the object as we go through the events, but it would end up with my, the last time I changed my name.
Exactly.
Right.
With that name.
Right. Okay.
And where can we use these? Well, now I gave the example of a user aggregate. That's how we do in mobile pay. We have a user microservice that contains this user aggregate, where your name and your SSN and the address basically is locked. It's a lock, right? It's a big lock. And whenever you log into the phone or into the app, it just pulls out the latest state, essentially. It doesn't pull out all events. It just gets it pulls out all the events in the service and then returns in an API just the current state, because that's usually what you need, essentially.
Right. Unless you're after something very specific. Right. Okay.
Yes. Well, it could be interesting. In some cases, you actually need to log, right? It could be for systems where you need to understand who have been accessing these. It could be a journal at a hospital. So which personnel has been accessing this journal, and at what time, and what have they been looking at? That's actually a good way to use an event source to log these things. And in that case, you could be interested to see the events. Like, so if you make if you make a UI on top of that aggregate, you will probably have a long list of the events. You just show the events and in the right order, and then whoever assessed this can see what happened and who did what.
All right. So does the aggregate actually provide you with like the complete list of events that has happened to the aggregate?
Yeah, the sort of concept aggregate can do that. Yes.
All right. Okay.
It's a bit different from implementation to implementation. So it's a bit up to how you coin these tooling, right? Because you have to make something around. You have to create sort of a base aggregate that contains all the basic stuff, like how to dispatch events, how to fetch events, the thing you were just asking about. So at least you have to sort of wrap it in somehow.
Right.
And that's sort of what an aggregate is, an essential aggregate can do for us. So what do we do with aggregate? We persist all, if we go back to the beginning of what I said there, if we look at that from a database perspective, you can take all those logs, or let's just call them events, because that's what they are. You can take all those events and you can put them into the event source, and you can categorize them as part of an aggregate you have decided they should be part of, like the user aggregate.
Okay.
That's the sort of essential about aggregates. That's why we use the term aggregate in this case, and aggregate boundary. And it's really good before you start to do these kind of things to sort of analyze and plan ahead. So what are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? and what is needed. And when I say what is needed, look at the business needs. What do this need to contain? Because in an aggregate boundary itself, you also have the business rules of that solution. So it could be a business rule in regards to age. You are not allowed to create a user in our product if you are below 18. Then you write that in your aggregate. I can show it in the demo. How I can actually write that in code and how it could look. But you will put all your business rules in there. And then every time you open a event source solution, if you use the same framework, of course, you can find all the business rules associated to this solution in the aggregate. That's sort of
All right. So the
given.
aggregate essentially enforces the business rules.
Yes, because you're not allowed to apply the event to the aggregate if you don't uphold the rules of the business rule.
Right. Okay. So you
So
started out with the domain-driven design, or DDD. Can you explain how DDD and event sourcing relate to each other? Are they like coined from the same person, or what? How do they relate to each other?
Well, event sourcing in itself is just a technique. It's a technique of persisting logs or events. DDD itself is a way of structuring the whole this technique in my mind. So you can decide to do event sourcing completely without aggregates, completely without entities, completely. You can call it something else. It's
Right.
just a way to sort of coin these things. And when you discuss what's in your aggregate, what's your entities, what's your service, what's your repositories, just a way. It's like when you discuss onion architectures, right? When people say they have made something like an onion architecture, where the repositories are, where the services are, and why it has been structured like it has been structured. It's a bit
Sure.
the same with DDD. It's a
Yeah.
way to structure the event sourcing technique. So you
Yeah.
sort of have something, a guardrail when you
Yeah.
coin
Yeah. And
terms.
having the same vocabulary as the people you work with, so it's easy to kind of communicate what you want to do and where the problem is and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. You talked a lot about events. Let's dig into what is that?
Yeah. So what is event? We can have two types of events. We can have a fat event or thin event. Uh, Usually in the event source system I've been working, we have been using thin events on the domain part and using fat events on the integration event part. So what do I mean by the domain part? So if we look at this drawing, we have something called a user service where there's a user aggregate. In that service, we also have an API, could be a ASP.NET Core API or whatever you used to work with. Essentially, that API just gets a command from your app that says create this user. The API then calls the business rules in the aggregate, say I want to create this user with this information. When that has been approved, written to the event source, something afterwards usually happens. It's something called it sends out something called a domain event, and I always call it on the backside of the user aggregate. So if you have a command, for example, that says create user, like do this now, you will probably also have a domain event called user created, like it has been done. And it's really important to stick to the wording because that means, again, you go back to what are we actually talking about? Because there's a lot of moving parts when using event sourcing, especially when you blow it up to a lot of services. Um, so it's really important to stick to this naming. Um, so what can we use these domain events for? They're usually thin events, as I explained before. That means there's only the exact information on that you needed. It could be on a user-created event, the data that changed on that event. That could be something like age, SSN, or other important information for that event. So let's say there's only those two properties on the event. This user service, will probably have a consumer internal on it that consumes to the domain event, because then it can take this domain event and persist the change into a read model if needed. It could be that it needs to maintain a read model of all the ages of people. like for statistics reasons. I'm not saying that's a good idea, that's better tooling, but let's just say that for the example's sake.
Yeah.
That's an internal thing that wouldn't be visible for any services outside this boundary. And when I talk about a user service in this context, it can be multiple deployables, but domain-wise, they belong together. So
Right.
usually you will deploy all these deployables together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's go over to integration event. They can potentially be fat events. That depends on the consumer that needs it. In this case, I've drawn in Rapid as the transport. An integration event could be so I've written user state changed. Let's just say it's user created integration event we send over Rapid. It could be some analytics service that is interested to know whenever a user has been created to like sort of keeping track of how many users do we actually have. That's the difference between integration events and domain events. Domain events stays inside the boundary. Integration events goes outside the boundary, because that also means if you are doing changes to your system, you can always go into, if you use Rapid or some other tools of sending these messages, you can always see who is actually using my data. So when you have to do a change to what SSM, and that impacts every single consumer on this, you need to sort of either make a backwards compatible change, or you need to talk with the consumer and say, hey,
Yeah.
this data is not available anymore, or
Yeah.
whatever. It's very visible. You can even sometimes you can even just search for your integration events in other people's code base to see if they use it right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
also a
Yeah. Yeah.
technique.
Yeah. Mm.
It's
But this would essentially mean that you have like you might have a data out of sync, so the eventual consistency thing here, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. That's a thing you have to consider when doing this.
Classic.
So why? Yeah, exactly. Why do we have eventual consistency? Well, that's because of the CAP theorem. What is the CAP theorem? Consistency, availability, and partition. And the rule says you can't have all three at the same time. And sorry, guys, this has been proven. You can't. You can try to convince me. I've not seen it. MIT supports me on that one. You can't have all three at the same time. That's not impossible. You have to give in something. Maybe we can be close to, but that's not the same as having it. Remember that.
Yeah.
But essentially, eventual consistency is that a change happens in your system. Somebody is listening to your integration event, and they sort of need to do something on the backside of that event happening. It
Mm.
could be an example in mobile pay is that whenever you do a payment, um, the receipt itself is actually somewhere else. It's in a different service. So that means every time we do a payment, we send out a payment completed integration event, and the other service picks it up and starts to render the receipts. So if usually it takes 50 milliseconds to be done, users don't know it and they don't see it and they don't care. That's like 99% of time. We have had issues on the publishing side when doing payments. That means the receipt service never gets the sort of, now this payment has been done with this information.
Right.
And that means users start to miss their receipts. So that's where we usually start to come into trouble. Just to talk a bit about the eventual consistency part. You also have to be aware of that's not really because of eventual consistency, but you have to be really aware of ordering when you subscribe to integration events, because usually for tools like, if we go back to the ordering, for tools like Rapid, you don't have an ordering guarantee. That means the user state change sequence 1 can be sent out, and the user state change sequence 2 can be sent out, but you receive 2 first over here and then 1 afterwards. And if sequence is important for your system, then you need to have a mechanism to handle that. Yep. So, I think I have a you could use stuff like a Delta repository on the consumer side. You could also use tools like Kafka or Event Hub and help those to sequence your stuff, right? But there's you could also use timestamp. I wouldn't recommend that because logical sequences are a lot easier to debug. And also there can be different issues with timestamp, especially when it's a distributed system with different machines.
Yeah.
Um, you have to be aware of that. That is really an important thing when we talk about event-driven architecture. When we start to use the whole event sourcing part and start to utilizing the whole async part of it, which is, if you ask me, is the really strong side. In it's fine with the sort of whole log-based persistence. That's great. You can do replays, you can do snapshots, as you also mentioned. You can there's a lot of optimization you can do. You can also do reconstitutions. Let's jump into that. What is a replay versus a reconstitution? If you remember what I talked about before in regards to domain events and integration events, replay essentially is running all your domain events inside your boundary. That means you're updating all the read models you have inside your service. Integration events is updating the read models you have in other boundaries, other services, like the example over here, where somebody is using the user created. Let's say an example of that would be they just spin up a service at a later point in time than when the service you're subscribing from it has been created. And you actually want to have all the information from the beginning of that service. Then you can kick off a reconstitution and resend all the integration events and sort of get back on track.
Yeah.
That's I think that's a really neat tool when we talk about event-driven architecture. And that's where event sourcing is a crucial component to do stuff like this. Because it's really hard to do without event sourcing, unless you have to come up with your own concepts, your own tooling. And when we talk about tooling, if you are in a company, don't do event sourcing like in 3 different ways or 4 different ways. Make a consensus, find one way of doing it. It doesn't need to be difficult. Just agree. I think that's really important because
Yeah.
you can have a lot of issues with event sourcing.
Are there any frameworks out there that you can kind of pick off the shelf and kind of get a turbo start on using event sourcing?
Eh, in mobile pay, a lot of great guys have just started from scratch by implementing it very simple, and we have sort of expanded from there. I sort of like that approach, but there are also toolings out there like for .NET there's Eventflow. I've been using Eventflow a bit because it has a lot of great integrations to different transports like Rabbit, Kafka, and these kind of things. But also think with Eventflow you get a lot, honestly. It has snapshotting and it has all these nice features, but you really get a lot. Um, so I think it's a really mature product, but it's also a lot to sort of comprehend if this is the first time you're doing this, because
Yeah,
you
yeah,
essentially
yeah.
just plug it in and then you call a command and then does a lot and suddenly poof that comes out a domain event in the end.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
um,
Yeah, but just like we talked about with EF Core, I mean, it's a big like set of tools, and you have to understand what you're doing, I guess. And I guess it's the same with every product out there. And definitely, event sourcing is not trivial. You get a lot of good benefits, but there's also uh, at least corners of it that are complex.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
So
Um,
if you're starting out a greenfield project today, how do you decide is event sourcing right or not? Should I go with event sourcing? Should I go with the traditional CRUD approach? How would you recommend kind of analyzing that if you're starting a new project?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Stefan. Um, Event sourcing is not a match made in heaven for everything, for sure. If you have a system that's driven on state changes, it could be payments, it could be some special product behavior, then you should really consider it. when you sort of just dive into, you have state changes on the same objects from multiple different places, like in a distributed system where you have load balancers in front of the systems, where you can get on the on the sort of same entity, you can get operations from two different machines at the same time. You should consider event sourcing, especially also if you have requirements afterwards, like other people want to utilize the data you have. It could also be you have some requirements about error handling with the error queue, like oh shoot, this payment didn't go through when the user did the payment. Let's try again later. These kind of state behaviors is a place where you should consider it. It can also be in a system like I mentioned before, like where you need to have trace of what people do. Um, uh, that's usually where I see it. But if you have a system where you can sort of plan before you start, and not just start, and you can already see when you go to the end of the project, you need to have a lot of error handling or great error handling. You need to be able to send out integration events or the share data with other services. You need to be able to defer stuff. Not that it's so all these components I'm mentioning right now, you can do that without event sourcing. No, not an issue. But you can also use event sourcing to sort of combine all these features and sort of to create an environment around it, which can help you. I think in mobile pay, we maybe have overdone it a bit, but I think that was because of all the utilities that go along with it, like what you sort of just get out of the box, and that's what you should focus on. You shouldn't necessarily focus on event sourcing itself, but also focusing on what capabilities can it give me afterwards in regards to support. It can be that there has something went wrong in a read model, or something went wrong in your in a read model in another service. You can actually replay or reconstitute without going into the database and changing the data. You actually have code control of the changes in the database, and I think that's quite powerful in itself.
Yeah. And you touch a little bit on a really important subject here, because it's very important that you remember that you can never ever change an event. If it's in the database, then it's read only. If you're going down that path, I know you can get into all sorts of trouble, right?
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
it's we also have to be pragmatic at some point, right? I teased with GDPR before. Um, Essentially, with GDPR, you are forced to go in and changing your event source in some way. It's not it's not always good enough just to sort of override it with a tombstone event that says when you read up this, yeah, the event from old times is there with all the data, but later on there comes a tombstone event. So when you get the latest data, it has been removed. Sometimes there are actually requirements for you to remove that or anonymize that original event. That's also a way of doing it. You still have the event, you still have the history, but you just anonymize the properties. There are pros and cons to each approach, but from time to time you are forced to changing the event source. It could also be the way you do snapshotting. If you really want to optimize your data and not just send all your data to cold storage, maybe you need to change your events a bit.
Hmm.
Um, that I think the good part for doing that with event sourcing is that you can, if you have a test environment, you can actually test these things off quite well and be able to. That depends on how you do the changes, but usually you have the option of rolling back to sort of keep that safety before you go into production.
Yeah. Yeah, but GDPR always creates all sorts of interesting challenges for us as developers and architects. I
Yes.
can't even say how many times I've had discussions with the legal people, and it's just like screaming underwater sometimes, because we just can't kind of agree on how the world should look like. It's
Yeah.
super frustrating.
But I'm just trying to be pragmatic in a world moving.
Sure, and that's what
I
you have to do, right? I mean, you can't
yeah
kind of just yeah, hide your head in the sand like an ostrich, right? You have to kind of
yeah
yeah. So should we look at some code, maybe?
yeah sure. Let's do that.
Yeah, yeah.
I sort of created a demo service, just for my own sake, also to do a little of hacking in my spare time. Uh, this service contains of a REST API, a DBOp. If you're not familiar with DBOp, it's basically the flyweight pattern, just a way of running your database scripts towards your database in a controlled manner. So essentially, there's just the event source itself. You can see here contains of a integer ID, a unique identifier for the aggregate, an aggregate type, a data blob that is big. And yes, I'm using a SQL, and yes, I'm using JSON blobs. That's the way I prefer working with this. You could for sure export this model to distributed database like Cassandra, where it will perform even better. Let's
And the
save that
data,
for another time.
is that in JSON, or how do you save that?
I persisted in JSON just for readability, and
Yeah,
that's easier way to work with it.
sure.
The code itself, reading it up is also a bit easier to read than if you do it in bytes,
Yeah,
unless you
yeah.
do stuff like DSOM and these kind of tools that can do some really awesome thing, or Mrs. Pack. But then you can't go into the database itself and just read it immediately.
Okay. But you
Other
basically
things is
just saved in like a regular SQL database.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's what we do in mobile pay today, and that's
yeah,
good enough for us.
yeah.
We have the metadata, which is timestamp and some other properties. We have the event type, which are very important, and the sequence that is important. The timestamp itself is taken from the database, but that's also just from my own visibility. When maybe there's an issue, I can go and see sort of when did this happen. Furthermore,
And
yeah.
the structure that you have here, is that like the best practice for how you want to save your events?
I think there are different approaches. So this is sort of a blob storage approach. I prefer that because that's simple for me. That means I can copy this table into a lot of different services. I know other people are trying to extrapolate the properties of the aggregates, like having a field for each event, or even more, having a table for each event. That I think there are different techniques with different pros and cons. This in my experience, this is sort of has been the uh, most mainstream way of doing it, if that makes sense to say.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That it's the one that hits the spot the most times.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
you give up on some performance, but it's not performance that we have ever needed, essentially.
And I mean, also, you obviously there's solutions for doing that. But if you want to look up data, it is not really feasible to do it if you want to do it like in regular SQL. You can't kind of like in the old days, right? In the CRUD days, like some business person will come, hey, what was the sales in last month? And you could do like the sum, blah blah blah. And, I mean, you can't really do that because the data is in JSON. It won't really work.
If you do it, if you do it with Postgres, you can, but that's a different
Sure.
thing.
Yeah.
But I agree, Stefan. Usually, no, I wouldn't do that. Essentially, the whole data column here would not be a good a column to search in. Essentially,
No, no,
um,
no.
for
But
these kind of
I mean, I like
tasks.
the simple structure. I mean, this is super easy to understand, and it's pretty easy to understand. Okay, it's JSON, so we can actually serialize it when we get back. Sorry, deserialize it. And yeah, it's I like the simple structure.
It's so that's the structure of the event source. Let's try to kick it off, and then we can
Sure,
jump into code.
sure.
We should be able to run it. Let's see if we have the curse of demos.
Yeah, that's always interesting.
So I have
Perfect.
different endpoints here. I have some read endpoints, a create, some changes on the aggregates, and a replay. let's just try to hit the create button off. It's just create an aggregate with this grid ID. It's not really important. I get a 200 back with the ID I have created. We can try and read it and see if we get something back. We don't. What about the event source? Yes, great. That's the curse of demos. Essentially, these endpoints should give us the event source itself with the events. Let's jump into the database instead of look at it, because we should now have pushed it into the database. Of course, great to have a SQL exception. Maybe my database is not up and running. Are we running? Should be running. Well, we should be able to see. Yeah, okay. It's in the database. I'm not sure why it thinks it's not, or what issue I have with the SQL client. But essentially, it's here now. So that is sort of a event in my database. That's it. That's not really anything more to it. It's if you remember the script we just saw of the event source, that's basically it. So we have the data blob here, which contains the event. It's essentially just the aggregate ID, the external aggregate ID, and then the event type in here.
The event type, yeah.
Yeah. And for usability's sake, the event type is also a line of itself, because then we can when we do replays, I can say I only want to do replays on dummy aggregate created events, and we have a sleek way of getting that out of the database. And we have start with events sequence 0. Hopefully, we should be able to do even more. If we take the aggregate ID, let's take this one that I created it with. Should be able to execute this. Okay, the client is not very fond of me right now. That's fair.
But let's look at the aggregate. I'm curious to see the aggregate.
Let's do that. So I've created a folder here called shared domain. A folder for domain. That's essentially where I have created the aggregate we just invoked. So we have something here called base aggregate. That's my only implementation of sort of the. I'll just wait a bit with going into that. Of the tools we need to get this up and running. When we call create, we essentially call this method. We can also, if we jump back a bit to the API, just follow it the whole way. I have put it into features, so it's feature sliced. We have the create controller here with mediator. If you remember that tool, I think Jimmy Bogart started to take money for it, but I like the mediator pattern itself. I have I send out a command with the two IDs I send in. If we look at the command handler, which we have over here.
So, and if you don't know it, then the command handler is basically what catches the call from the mediator based on the type.
Yes.
You don't know the mediator pattern. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's a great pattern. Good. It's calling, it's loading, it's creating a new aggregate, because we know at this point in the create method there is not a new, this aggregate shouldn't exist. So what we try to do, we try to create it. We call the create method that I just said. So what does it do? It takes the ID, sets it on the aggregate. It emits the event, dummy aggregate created event. And remember, it's the naming again. It's created at this point. Okay. And we invoke something called a when method. The when method, the important thing to know about the when method is every time you spin up the aggregate, every time you want to have the latest state, all the when method are called in the order of the sequence of the event. So the create event is sequence 0. So that's the first when method that is called with the information that we saw in the database. Oh,
sure.
So I don't know.
So that's the when methods are essentially what kind of morphs the object properties as you go through the events.
Exactly, and it gets fit with the information in the data field. Good. In this case, I wanted to show you sort of the business rule I have here. The increase temperature, where I try to increase temperature, and I said that if it's 0, remember to change the temperature, because then we don't want to lock an event essentially, right? So that's sort of a way to write your business rules. You can always go in to find your aggregate in a service, and that's where you can read the business rules. So if you get a task from a PM or PO, whatever you call it, then you can always, if you say there's a limitation on having, I don't know, H500, I need to change that to 450. Then you just jump into the dummy aggregate or the user aggregate, whatever you call it, and then change that rule because you know it's there. And when you read a PR and they write business rules outside of the aggregate, then please comment it. It's the point here. Collect it in here because then you know it's there.
But wouldn't that be? Couldn't that end up being very, very messy, like a very, very big class?
Yes.
If you have a lot of business rules.
Yes, and that's why it's really important to plan your domains and to plan your aggregates in those domains, like beforehand you start. Of course, you cannot. You don't know everything from the beginning, but you can at least try. And there's something called an event storming. When you start up a new project, you can try to hit off an event storming. And what an event storm essentially is okay, let's get the team together. We have a task here. We want to create a weather storm service. Okay, so this weather storm service, it needs to its requirements are it needs to send out alerts, it needs to send out warnings, it needs to log this data, it needs to tell this person if something goes wrong. Then you can start to sort of generate the events, and you just do 5-minute sessions with people and say, come up with all the events you can come up with for this service. And then you already are in a good planning phase at that point. Sort of what are we looking into, and then you also start to coincide the naming, the ubiquitous language of that domain you're creating right there, right? And maybe some other people say, I don't think this belongs together with this. Maybe we should split it in two. So it's also a lot about teamwork here. Essentially, if you have a one-man company, maybe this is not what you need. Domain-driven design and event sourcing is just as much a communicative tool than coding, right?
Yeah.
Apropos why I say it's important to have the business rules in here. If you're a one-person company, monolith is probably completely fine to what you're doing. And you can also have a event sourced monolith, like you have one event source for essentially everything. You can also go that route.
Yeah.
But if we go back into the track here to sort of follow the trail, when the when method has been called for our create method, if we go back to the command handler, we call something called dispatch. So dispatch is sort of the commit, like commit to the database now. And the dispatch method itself can also throw an exception, like say, hey, this sequence you're trying to write this event into has already been taken. In my example here, I haven't handled all those cases, but this is something you need to handle when you call dispatch. And that's, of course, what you get when you use framework like event flow. If we jump into the dispatch, it should be quite simple. I have something down here called shared domain. There I've created something called an event dispatcher. Essentially, it writes to the SQL event store, and it publishes the event with the event publisher. The event publisher in this case is the domain event publisher. So that means it's publishing internal, like we talked about.
Okay, so it's not an event. Integration event.
Now I'm thinking about it. I made it like it's both. So it's in this case for my implementation, it's essentially both. It sends out the domain event, and if there is an integration event, it also sends out that.
Okay.
But if we look at the SQL event store writer, which the dispatch method calls, this is the insert. That's really it. So I serialized this sort of data field. I put in, and I serialized the metadata field. I put in the type, the sequence, and everything, and just add it. And remember what I said. And don't copy this example and think everything is great. You need in this example to add the optimistic congruency part, where you have a log around the sequence and the aggregate ID and type.
Yeah.
So
But
you're
we're just keeping it
so
simple here, just to kind of get the gist of it. Yeah.
exactly. So when this SQL query has been fired off, you go back to the command handler where you return all the way out to the REST API and return the ID. If you go back into the feature and look here,
Yeah.
that's essentially it. You can also see here what it returns. It's returning a dummy aggregate ID on this command. That's sort of the essential part of how to do event sourcing. And I hope that was simple.
Yeah. I get it. Do you have an example of a projection as well?
I don't have included projection in this case. We can talk
Okay.
about projections, but I've not included the code itself because I usually stick to read models. But essentially, you can use projections, especially if you have sort of a big aggregate that you want to have sort of read out in a different way. In many cases, sort of the life cycle of an event source system is that you create a read store or read repository for that aggregate you created. Sort of just, I give you this aggregate ID, just give me the current state of that aggregate ID. I see that pattern a lot, and that's fine. That's not an issue with that. The only thing with that is that if the aggregate grows over time, you basically get everything, and that's not always the best thing, especially not if you have a lot of different events. Maybe you are interested in creating a projection of that aggregate, like a new view of that aggregate. You don't want to persist it in a read model and read it up from there. But you just, every time you ask for its aggregate ID with this projection, you just want the slice of that aggregate. So it's a way of slicing up your aggregate if it has grown too large over time. In itself, it can be a bit of a smell because you should try to keep aggregates small and finite. They should be able to be bound in some way. So if you can design a system where your aggregates are bound, that would be the most optimal situation. It's not always possible. I gave the
Right.
example
You could have
myself with the
scenarios
user
where
aggregate.
there's just events on events on events on events, and it's not really possible to do it any other way. Right.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and at some point you hit the wall, you can't read all the 50,000 events out, or you need to start to do snapshotting. That's where snapshotting techniques comes in, where you can sort of wash the aggregates or offload some of the events to code stores that are not relevant anymore. So there are different techniques that you can move on to. I think the thing we haven't talked about, I have it included in my demo as well, but the thing we haven't talked about is sort of event upgrading. I don't know if Stephanie, you heard of the term before.
I was assuming it's about versioning, right?
It's versioning of the existing events. So it could be that because of new new requirements from business, you need to have, I don't know, 2 surnames. So on the user created event where there is a surname, you need to create a surname too. But you also need to be able to be backwards compatible. And that's where event upgrading comes in. And that's event upgrading is essentially just plugging in to the stream when you replay the aggregates and sort of try to create the aggregated state. That's where it sort of operates. So it operates in code. It doesn't persist anything. And that's the important thing here, because then you can always manipulate it and change it. Sort of, if you do a bad change, you can always roll it back. If you do a bad change to the database, you can not always roll back. And I think that's
Right.
one nice way of working with event sources
And
as
how do
well.
you control, like, you obviously there's a time where, okay, now the new version is up and running. How do you kind of control, like, up until this point we used the version 1, now we use version 2? How do you kind of control that?
You put that into the event upgrader. So
Okay.
that means if you have a V1, then you then you put surname 2 to empty. It could be
Right.
just an
Yeah.
example, right? Or you say SendIn2 is not available, something like that, right? You
Right.
create a backwards compatible pattern essentially.
Ah, okay.
That could
Okay.
be.
Okay.
There usually are more complex scenario than the one I
Of course.
mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, Rene, we are running out of time. Did you have anything else that you want to show us before we wrap up?
Um, what could be important to show? I don't think I have any specific thing to show, but I think what I want to say about it is keep it simple. If you want to try this out, just start simple. Don't make it too overcomplicated. It can do a lot of really great stuff for you
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
treat
yeah,
it well.
absolutely. I mean, as always, keep it simple, stupid, right? I
Exactly.
live by that because you can always make it complex as soon as you're up and running, right? And the requirements start pouring in. But yeah, definitely. And I think you showed it really well, Rene. I think that you showed it. There's essentially it's a basic pattern, right? It's not
Yeah.
complicated. I mean, it can get complicated depending on your requirements, but like baseline event sourcing is not complex.
No. Exactly.
All right. All right. Pretty cool. So
Hmm?
the last part that we have before we say goodbye for today is the opportunity for you to give you some shameless plugs and shout outs to maybe someone you know that helped you a lot or a cool framework or whatever. Do you have anything up your sleeve?
I've always been a big fan of .NET, especially what they've done with .NET Core. I'm running on a MacBook right now, and I think that's great. And of course, shout out to all the good people that have taken me in mobile pay. People like Martin Kasper, Christian Horsdal, Erik Olsen, and a lot of great consultants that has been part of mobile pay over the year. They have really taken me in well and taught me up to why it's important, why naming is important, and why coincising the terms is really important, especially over time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's I think that's great.
Yeah, it is super important. And yeah, and I've been at your shop for yeah, it's the second time I'm there now, and I really enjoy it because you have so many talented people, and like the culture is really good. So be proud of that for sure. It's a great place. I've seen much worse in my career, so you're doing a great job, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate that you stopped by my small podcast and shed some light on the event sourcing corner of our little .NET world.
Of course, that's my pleasure, Stefan.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it for now, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Code Chameleon podcast. I'll be back next month with another episode. I don't know what's it going to be, but if you have any input or requests, please let me know. Well, until next time, keep it simple.